Someone once told you you should open up more. They said it gently, with good intentions. But you didn't feel comforted, you just felt tired. Not because you lack emotions, but because to open up, you would have to rearrange an entire house, a house you worked so hard to finally keep quiet. You would have to turn on the lights, explain every crack, retell everything you've lived through to someone who has never lived there. And you already know, in the end, you'll be the one turning the lights off again. So this time, you just smile. You don't argue. You don't defend yourself. You simply stop explaining. This video is for those who already understand. Their silence is not about shutting people out, it's about keeping their home intact. There is something that needs to be said from the very beginning, clearly, slowly. You didn't disappear. You simply no longer show up in the same way. This house is still here. The walls are still standing. The foundation is still solid. There are no signs of collapse. The lights are just turned off. You still wake up every day. You still do what needs to be done. You still respond when it truly matters. You still function, neatly. But you no longer lay everything out in the open. Not because you're cold, not because you're angry, not because you've changed for the worse. Maybe you've lived long enough to stop feeling the need to turn on the lights for others, just so they can check whether everything in your house is still okay. Maybe you've heard things like, "You seem different lately. You're quieter than you used to be." What they don't see is this. Inside, everything is intact. Perhaps what you stopped doing was performing your okayness. There's nothing here that needs fixing. There's nothing that needs to be returned to. Nothing here is broken. It's just not on display anymore. And if there's ever a moment when you wonder whether you're disappearing, pause for a second. Listen. You can still hear the clock ticking. You can still see just enough light to keep from stumbling inside your own home. You didn't disappear. There is a very simple reason why, after everything you've been through, your body chose silence. Not because it's broken, but because it learned, after prolonged periods of stress, the brain doesn't try to expand anymore. It tries to conserve. It reduces unnecessary signals, especially social ones. Not because people become dangerous, but because constant explaining costs too much energy. Silence, in this case, is not avoidance, it's optimization. Like in a house, when the electrical system starts to overload, you don't shut off the main breaker. You turn off the lights you don't need. The house doesn't lose power. It simply runs at a sustainable level. Research on post-traumatic growth points to something crucial. Change doesn't come from the pain itself, but from how the internal system reorganizes in order to survive. In some people, that reorganization looks like becoming stronger. In others, it looks like becoming quieter, and both are forms of adaptation. When intrusive thoughts begin to subside, when the brain stops replaying old questions, it chooses a different path. Less talking, less explaining, fewer signals sent outward. Your silence is not avoidance. It's efficiency. Your body didn't give up. It learned how to preserve energy for what truly matters. Low, warm lighting, a stable temperature. Nothing more is needed. Your system learned. Society is accustomed to signals, voices, responses, eye contact, proof that you're still there. When those signals begin to fade, other people grow uneasy. They can't see inside your house. They're standing outside the door. And when they knock and hear no answer, they fill in the silence themselves. They call it distance, coldness, sometimes even arrogance. But they don't see what you're actually doing. You didn't withdraw from people. It feels more like you no longer want to keep playing a familiar role. There's a difference, subtle but crucial. In social life, we're taught that connection always comes with explanation. That to be understood, you have to keep opening the door and turning on the lights. But for those who've been through too much, the truth is this. Every explanation forces you to relive a part of what happened. Every attempt to make someone understand costs more energy you worked hard to preserve. So, at some point, you make a very quiet decision. You stop correcting misunderstandings. You stop adjusting how others see you. Not because you agree with them, but because you realize that continuing to explain is no longer worth it. Being misunderstood is the price you quietly pay for peace. Misunderstanding stops being a communication failure. It becomes a tax. A tax you choose to pay to keep what's inside undisturbed. You let the knocking fade into the distance, not because you're afraid, but because you know, if you open the door, you'll have to turn the lights back on. And this time, you choose differently. No resentment, no defense, just a boundary that remains still. Outside, they can keep calling your name in whatever ways they need. Inside, you keep the right not to answer. In this house, there are things you no longer touch. Not because they hurt, but because they've already finished their role. On the shelf, there's an old photograph. You turned it face down at some point you can't quite remember. Not to forget it, just so you don't have to see it every day. In that photo is a version of you who once laughed easily, talked a lot, trusted quickly, stayed longer than necessary. You don't hate that person. You just don't live there anymore. In the corner of the room, there's an old chair. The fabric is worn, one leg slightly uneven. That's where the you from before used to sit, where conversations stretched until the sky went dark. The chair is still here. No one took it away. You didn't replace it with a new one. You simply don't sit there anymore. This sadness isn't loud. It doesn't demand a name. It doesn't need to be processed. It just stands there like a room you no longer use, but still keep the key to. Maybe you still miss that old version of yourself, even if you don't live there anymore. There was no accident, no moment of collapse. After everything you've been through, you just couldn't live there any longer. You didn't lose that version of you. You simply stopped living there. No farewell was held. No clear goodbye was spoken. Just one evening when you turned off the lights and didn't turn them back on. Dust hanging in dim light. The familiar scent of old wood still in the air. Everything is still here. It's just no longer being used. And that doesn't need to be explained. There's a very small moment that few people notice. Not when you withdraw. Not when you're exhausted. But when you realize you're allowed to choose. Your hand rests on the light switch. It doesn't shake. It doesn't hesitate. You know exactly what will happen if you turn the light on. You'll have to explain again. Tell the story again. Rearrange your words so they fit the way someone else understands. And you also know what happens if you don't. No conflict, no victory. Just the quiet you've been missing for a long time. This decision is not an act of resistance. It isn't aimed at anyone. It's simply discernment. You don't close the door because you're afraid of being seen. You close it because you're no longer obligated to give others access to what's inside you. In psychology, people who've lived through trauma often develop a very quiet kind of strength. The ability to set boundaries without explanation. Not to control others, but to protect autonomy over their own energy. You didn't stop speaking because you ran out of feeling. You stopped speaking because you rewrote your role in this story. You're no longer the one who has to prove they're okay. You're the one who decides who gets to turn the lights on in your house. This is not withdrawal. This is authorship. The soft click of the switch barely audible. Then silence. No new light appears. None is needed. Just a choice finally named for what it is. Choice. By this point, there's nothing left to prove. The house settles into evening. No transition. No signal. No sound to mark the shift. The lights are still off, but you no longer call it darkness. Everything becomes still in a way that feels familiar. You don't need to wonder whether you should open the door again. You don't need to ask yourself what others might think if you remain quiet. No one is being abandoned. No one is being rejected. There is simply a boundary being held in the right place. You've moved past the stage of explaining why you need quiet. You no longer need to justify that this quiet makes sense. It's just necessary. If someone is standing outside and doesn't understand, that doesn't require you to step out. Perhaps you no longer feel the need to give the world a detailed map of the house inside you. You don't owe anyone access to the inside of your house. Inside, everything is warm enough, dark enough, safe enough. There's no next plan, no promise. Just you where you're meant to be. And that doesn't need to be filled with anything else.